All right, perfect.
Okay. So we've talked in the past about Casey's childhood. Could you tell us the story of Casey from the time he was a child and what it was like growing up and moving around the Midwest up until he left home?
To tell the story about Casey's childhood, I think that the most important aspect is that his father built concrete grain elevators all over the Midwest, and so the family was constantly moving while they lived in a very small trailer in the beginning. I mean, I think when Casey was born, the trailer was only 16 or 18 feet long, and so the three of them were living in that. And then, of course, later his mother had two more children, girls, and so I think they got maybe a trailer that was a little bit longer, maybe 21 feet. But so that was a huge influence because his father, right from the very beginning, started him out as some kind of a carpenter. When he was only 5, he had his own tool belt that he wore to the site. So he grew up with helping his father build concrete grain elevators. And so what that meant, besides the fact that that he attended over 35 schools, 35 plus, in addition to that, I just lost my train of thought.
Just keep going, like,
Okay.
because we can edit, we can stop and
Mm-hmm.
then start over. So just
So it meant that when they would pull into a new town to start the grain elevator, in order to find employees to help, they needed a whole crew of men, and so they had to take whoever they could find in each of these little towns. And so sometimes it would be the town drunk. It might be one of the men was had been in a mental institution and just recently got released. There were people from the circus that his father had hired. So he got exposed to all different forms of humanity. But in the meantime, he had this solid basis of being a Southern Baptist because his parents were very much so. And so that each time they moved to a different town, even though they were living in a trailer, his mother took it upon herself to become involved in the church, and it didn't have to be a Baptist church. It was as long as it was a church, and because she was a singer, most of the time or many of the times she would become the director of the church choir. But in the meantime, Casey had to prove himself because he was always the new kid on the block, and he wasn't. He was a little bit awkward in his build. He was a very tall man, and he had very, very large feet. In fact, as a full-grown man, he wore size 15 AAA shoes, which meant that his feet were more like skis. But in any event, I think his build contributed to him feeling awkward and not having rhythm and being the new kid on the block. And so he would constantly have to get into fist fights and to defend himself. And so then the other piece of it was because his parents were very religious and because he grew up in the church, they expected him to be the next Oral Roberts, because evidently at age 14 he gave a sermon in the church that impressed everybody. And so he already was like maybe building on those oratory skills that he would need later on when he became a professor. So so his parents were very disappointed then later when the Vietnam War came and Casey he was a protester against it. He was not in agreement with the Vietnam War, and his parents were very unhappy with that. And that is when he started not feeling the same way about being a Southern Baptist. He was so disappointed that he felt that not just his parents, but also evidently the church minister didn't support him in what his belief system was. And so So at that time, I think that then was the end of his belonging to any kind of a church. And probably then the beginning of him wanting to be a philosophy professor. And I mean, maybe not so much a professor as just philosophy in general, trying to really understand what is reality and how many different ways can you look at it. He wanted his mind to be open. He didn't want it to be closed. But he will tell you that that started out as a Southern Baptist, that he really felt that Southern Baptists were people that wanted to have a free mind and look at things the way that they wanted to. So, so at that point, he met his to-be wife, and she was a protester too, and so they were at the Days of Rage in 1978 in Chicago. And I think at that time is when he was attending the Institute of Art in Chicago. What actually happened was he married his wife, who also was a professor, but she was a professor and scholar of theater. Rose Bank is her name, and she has written several books. She travels all over the world giving talks about theater and all the things that she knows about the theater, Shakespeare and such. So when they got married, he, for 4 years, was a philosophy professor at a small college. But because his wife then quit her job at whatever university she was at, I'd have to look that up to see what the name of it was. So they moved, and he couldn't get a job where she was at. And so that was when he had already had such a love of woodworking. Growing up with his father, I mean, he not only knew how to do wiring and plumbing and I don't even know what all. But anyway, whatever it all was, how to make models out of cement and then turn them into wood. And he had a lifelong love of wood. So he really told me that he didn't really mind that he left teaching after those first 4 years as a philosophy professor and started his own woodworking business, which was called Woodworks. And in that business, he was such a good wood carver that a lot of his business came from churches. And he was able to not only carve all the different intricate things that are in a church, from church pews to, he called it church linen. And I'm not sure I exactly know what that means, but whatever it was. And I know that he told this story that he once had to do over 100 spindles for the church of some kind of spindle. And he did it all by hand, and they were exactly perfect.
Give me.
Okay, so tell me about Casey's childhood, moving around in the trailer and doing work with his father.
Casey grew up traveling from town to town through the Midwest because his father built concrete grain elevators. And from a small child, he was part of that. He had his own little tool thing that he would hold with all the tools in it when he was only 5 years old. So he grew up going from town to town and learning all kinds of things about people because his father had to hire whoever was available at each town that they would move to. And through all this, his family was very religious, and they attended the church in whatever town they moved to, but they were basically Southern Baptists that whole time.
Now, you mentioned that when they moved from town to town, they moved specifically in their own home. Tell me about his life and how they moved from town to town. What did they take with them? He went to 35 different schools. What were they moving in?
So they lived in a very tiny trailer in the beginning because there was just Casey and his parents, and I think that trailer was only 16 feet long. And then eventually his mother had 2 more children, girls, and they got a little bit bigger of a trailer. But basically they were moving, each time that the concrete grain elevator was finished, they moved, picked up everything and then moved to the next town. And the mother would oftentimes become the director of the choir at the church. And in the meantime, you know, Casey would have to be adjusting to whatever crew of men that they hired at that particular time. So sometimes circus people and people with mental illness, alcoholics, whoever didn't have a job when his father arrived.
Okay, and now Casey actually, you said.
Ellen, you're jumping in there a little too quick.
Okay, sorry.
She hadn't stopped talking before you jumped in, so
Thank you. I'm sorry.
pause.
Okay, so let's go back to that. Tell me about his mother and the type of people who Casey was exposed to at each stop.
Okay. So his mother and father were very religious Southern Baptists, but his father had to hire whoever was available at each of the towns that they lived in whenever they arrived to build the concrete grain elevators. And that meant a crew of people that were available, and oftentimes that would mean people from the circus. It might mean somebody that had just been released with had been, you know, institutionalized with a mental illness, alcoholics, that sort of like the dregs of society. And Casey had to learn to adapt to them. And when he was 14, his father put him in charge of a crew, and so at 14 he became a supervisor of those men building the concrete grain elevators.
Now, his mother was a singer.
And his mother was a singer, and oftentimes, and so at each town, they would go to church, whatever church was available. If it wasn't a Southern Baptist, they would go to whatever was available. And oftentimes, his mother would become the director of the church choir. So she was very, very active. And I know that he was proud to tell that she sent out over 500 Christmas cards each year, because she kept track of all these people and how, I mean, at least 35 schools is what Casey attended in his lifetime. And it might have been more, but it was at least 35. So anyways, an amazing story.
Perfect.
Okay, so Casey was in line to be a preacher. That's what his parents wanted him to do. But he instead moved away from that and became a Vietnam protester, and a college professor, and a woodworker. Very succinctly, tell me about that change in him.
As Casey grew up, one of the constant things was woodworking. His father was a woodworker too. And of course the church was a big part of their life as they moved from town to town. But, and they did expect him, his parents did expect that he would be a preacher when he grew up. So when he was 14, he did preach in a church. But after that, it wasn't long after that, when he got to be about 18, that the Vietnam War broke out. And at that time, he did not agree with the Vietnam War, and he protested against it, and his parents disowned him for that for a while. So then, because of that, that sort of changed everything. That was another milestone in his life. And so he also wanted to teach and be a philosopher, because he was living the life of the mind, but he also had a way of connecting woodworking with the mind, that somehow when he chipped away at the wood, he said that the beauty would start coming out, and he would let in the light. And so he later on told me that when he taught philosophy to students, that it was very much like woodworking in that way.
And okay. So now, after Casey had become a protester, started his woodworking business, you met him. Tell me about meeting Casey and how you two ended up married.
When I first met Casey, he was married to a theater scholar. I worked in the theater department at the University of Toledo, and we always met people that knew people that we hired. And so when we hired his wife in the theater department, he was a woodworker with his own woodworking business. And so I helped him move in. All of us did that worked in the theater. There was a whole group of us that helped him. And he and I had the most wonderful conversation that we stood out on his deck, and it was all about philosophy and religion, which has always been so dear to my heart. But he was married to somebody else. And so she eventually quit that job, his wife, and they moved to Kent State. And then he got a divorce, and he came back to Toledo. He had remembered that conversation with me, and so had I, because I had wondered what it would be like to be able to talk that way to somebody. So he called me for a date, and I went, and he told me he was living in a warehouse carving wood, so I went over there on the first date, and that was when I saw his carving of Norman Jean, which did not make me very happy because it was pretty shocking and I didn't understand it. But then we talked, and I began to understand more about him, and I got him, and he hadn't been here. He was with a PhD, and he wasn't being a professor. He was being a night watchman, so he could carve this, what I thought was a very ugly figure. But I got him a job at the theater department, and that was his first time teaching again after 17 years of having his woodworking business.
So you've met Casey, you go on this first date at the warehouse, and you're shocked by Norma Jean, but something clicked with the two of you.
Something clicked because I've always had such an interest in philosophy and religion my own self, and he stimulated so many ideas in me. We had such wonderful conversations. So after he got started teaching back in the theater department, because he had all the background for it, he also got a 1-year visiting professorship with the philosophy department at the University of Toledo. And during that time is when he saw an ad for Warren Wilson College that I can remember when he showed it to me, because it so fit who he was, because they wanted a college professor, or philosopher, but also someone that was broader. And so he was teaching, by that time he was teaching business ethics to adults in downtown Toledo. So when he saw this ad at Warren Wilson, he brought it in and he said, "This is it. This is for me," because he can teach art, he can teach business ethics, he can teach philosophy, on, and he's had all this business background. So we came down for an interview, and it was so beautiful here, and that's how it all began.
Tell me about getting married and the move to Warren Wilson College in Swannanoa, North Carolina.
Well, when they met him, when we came down for the interview, I mean, they knew that they wanted him, and so we packed up all his woodworking equipment, which meant that it was more than what you could get into the trunk. And so as we were moving down here, I was following him, and the tires were smoking, and so he couldn't pull into any of the weigh stations where they want to weigh it, because they would have arrested us because the truck was too heavy. And so when we pulled in down here, they had put us into a little log cabin, and when we pulled next to the log cabin, our moving truck was bigger than the log cabin. So that was how our whole adventure at Warren Wilson began. And then, okay.
What year did you move to Warren Wilson? Tell me about the year. Give me some time frame here, and when you got married, and
Okay.
tie in the time for me from when you got married to moving to Warren Wilson and getting here. Okay.
So we were married in a meadow outside of my apartment building in 1989, and we had quite the little ceremony out there, and it was fun. And so then he was still teaching at the university, and then that was when he brought in the ad for Warren Wilson and told me that he knew that that was where we belonged, and sure enough, we went on the job interview and they did hire him. So we moved down here in July of 1991, and that is when our moving truck was bigger than the log cabin that they had rented to us. And so that was very interesting. And he began teaching, and I can remember one of my friends saying that he was the only one in the faculty that had completely read and memorized what they call the green document, which is the rules of the faculty. And in any meeting, Casey could always give the right answer because that's the way he was. He was just so conscientious and knew so much, was such an intellect. But of course, you know, the main thing was that he loved the students. And so he didn't talk about leaving the whole world of woodworking and art furniture and everything. The only time he mentioned it was to compare woodworking to teaching philosophy. That chipping away the wood to see the beauty in the wood reminded him of chipping away at students' black-headed minds to help open them up to see a broader world. And now, when you read through what some of the students have said since his death, almost every letter mentions the life-changing event of being in one of John Casey's courses that broadened them and changed their lives forever.
So you lived in a log cabin and then you moved to this home. Tell us about that move and what you discovered here and what he saw here.
Well, after we lived in the log cabin for 2 years, this house came up for rent at that time. And when we moved here, I was amazed at the skill that he had, that I didn't know that he could completely tear the kitchen apart and change where the sink is, and so he could do plumbing and wiring. And in the meantime, he wanted us to be sustainable because he was teaching environmental ethics. And so he started growing vegetable beds with the idea that more and more we would grow our own food, and he started canning. But in the meantime, he started also rebuilding this house. And he also there's lots of mystery about him that I don't understand, and that it's only now that since he's gone that I have been learning all these things about this amazing man, that some of it is a mystery. I don't know why he had such an interest in the Lakota Indians, although I know that he was part Indian. I know that he was 1/16 Indian. But it drove him to not only learn the Lakota language, but also to build a Lakota sweat lodge that was exactly based on their kinds of rituals, which eventually led into, not only did he totally transform our backyard and build that Lakota sweat lodge, but he began doing Lakota ceremony in speaking the Lakota language. And the whole ritual that the Lakota Indians used is how he did the sweat ceremonies.
So you mentioned that you found things after Casey passed, and one of those things has to do with the sweat lodge. What have you found?
Well, one thing I found was that he was making a book with pictures of each step along the way of building the sweat lodge. I never knew that book existed. I found it afterwards. But it's not the only thing I found. And then that is part of the mystery of John Casey. Because I didn't know about all the other pieces of art that were down in our basement that had been packed away for 27 years. And so one of the first things that we uncovered was a box that were 2 wooden carved hands to perfection. But what made me cry when I saw them is they are his hands, his blood veins, his wrinkles, They're his hands. They are a work of perfection.
You keep going if you want to, because
I
that was
thought you were stopping.
no. I'm sorry, and that was beautiful, and that.
So you've discovered these hands in the basement, and they're John's, they're Casey's hands. Tell me what you felt the moment you opened those hands.
When I opened the box and saw that they were his hands, I was so moved by the beauty and the perfection that I saw in those hands. It was like, oh my God, who was this man? I mean, I knew that he had carved Norma Jean, and Norma Jean I understand is a work of art too, but somehow these unfinished hands with no stain and nothing on them, just raw, to perfection. So that was another time that I had to ask the question, who is this man? How many other things are there about him that I don't know and that I never knew? And because of being married to him, the philosopher, I did have to ask the question, who am I? How do you tell who somebody is? Is it about what they did? Is it about what they left behind? And the thing that he most left me with is the questions. That's what I learned from John Casey. It's always about the questions, and you don't have to know the answer. So I'll never really know who he is. I can only just tell, and we can see all the things that he did, and we can read about what the students had to say about him. And there is how we'll look for the answers to who was John Casey. And all I know is that he has taught me about death in such a way that I understand he was ready. And he wanted to teach us, because his lesson was that he wanted us to live our lives fully engaged in whatever we were feeling. So with his death, he wanted us to be sad. He wanted me to be sad. And that is in his letter, the letter that he left for his students, which between that letter and Norma Jean, I believe, are his two magnum opuses, or whatever, however you say that word.
Give me a clap. All right.
So Casey finds out he has cancer.
So Casey found out that he had cancer in February, just really a year ago, February in 2016. And it went fast. We didn't think it was going to be that fast. We didn't really even think it was that bad in the beginning. But I realize now that whole year and right up until the end was more about him teaching us about how to live and teaching us how to die. And so the amazing thing is, after being married to him 27 years, I really didn't completely understand the relationship that he had with his students. Not really. Until he lay dying. And what he wanted me to do was he wanted me to open the door, and he sent out a message that all the students were welcome to come and hold his hand and talk to him as he lay dying. And so we opened the door, and long lines of students lined up. And as they came through, each one of them gave me so much love. And then they wanted to hold his hand and tell him how much they loved him. And at the very end, he could even no longer talk, and they didn't care. And one of the amazing stories was, I had to put a sign on the door one day because he was vomiting so much. And I said, no more visitors today. And so a student showed up. And I found out that he had flown here from New York without telling me he was coming. And he had read that sign, and he was so dejected as he was walking away. And so my daughter went out and talked to him and found out what the story was. So she brought him in here, and I have the letter that he wrote to Casey. But his bottom line was that there were several other of Casey's former students in New York, and he names them in his letter, all wanting him to tell Casey how much they loved him and what a difference he made in their lives, that their lives had changed. And that goes along with one of the final donations that we've had to the John Casey Scholarship Fund that was started here at Warren Wilson, was for $20,000. This is within the last few weeks. And that $20,000 donation is from the parents of a girl who was not a philosophy major. She's a writing major. And she only had 2 classes with Casey. But those classes were life-changing, enough that the parents wanted the scholarship fund. So anyway, there is this whole part of him that I kept learning about. I was so overwhelmed by the students who came here and what they worshipped him, and I'm not in a guru kind of a way, but much more about that he opened them up so they could do their own thinking. And then we're back to chipping away, that he chipped away and he let in the light. And I do believe that not just for his students, but for me, he changed my life, and we're back to living in the questions. And he wanted to die in such a way that he was an example of how you die. And the way that you die, my understanding of what he meant, is that you're fully engaged in the sadness. You don't try to hide it. It is part of the journey. And he wrote a wonderful letter to his students that went out to the community, and that letter has grown and been sent out to so many people, because it is about this whole thing about living in the questions and the art of dying and the art of living. And that's what Casey was all about. He dedicated his life to opening up minds and actually opening up wood. And I think that Norman Jean is such an example of a man that was way ahead of his time, who wanted to celebrate diversity, and he wanted to blur the distinction between art and craft. And so Norman Jean is an example of not only the great artistry that man had, but also Norman Jean is functional, so that she is also a liquor cabinet. And that was his way of celebrating, first of all, this transgender that lived in downtown Toledo. And Casey had made the decision he was going to have a whole series of street people. But then he met me. And he had just started on the second figure when he met me. And then that's when his whole life changed. And he devoted his life to being a philosophy professor and my husband, and transforming this house in so many ways. I mean, he rebuilt this house and the whole backyard, and he built chicken coops that match our house, and we had all these raised beds, and all I ever did was grow roses, and I don't know anything about gardening, sorry to say. And so now it's very difficult with him being gone to try to keep this whole thing going, because I don't know how to do that. There's so much I don't know. There's so much he didn't tell me. I didn't know about so much of the art that was down there and how beautiful it was. I had an artist that passed through here who, when he saw those hands, he said this was a world-class artist. How did he get to be a world-class artist? I don't know. I mean, I guess a lifetime of woodworking and 1 year at the Chicago Institute. I don't know the answer to that. But there we are again with the questions.
All right, clap.
Running naked.
The reason that Casey ran naked is in the letter that he left for his students. He felt that when he ran naked through the woods with the wind blowing on him, that he became the wood. He became the wind. He was trying to break down distinctions because he really believed that we were all one. And all we had to do was find ways to to get rid of the separation. So when he ran naked, he said he became the wind. When he ran through the snow, he became the snow. And it was only when he fell down that it brought him back to reality of separation. And so he was trying to break through separation to understand what it is to be all one. What does that mean? I mean, I can say that as a concept. I want to believe that. But he lived it. He taught it. That is really what he was about. And at the end of his letter to his students, he says that he wants to go into the is, where he just is, the great isness.
Now, he allowed his students to come into the home as he lay dying. Was that an unusual thing for Casey? Tell me about that moment.
So Casey asked me to open the door, and we sent out a letter to the whole community that he was inviting everyone to come in and be with him as he lay dying. It would not have been my way to do things. I tend to be more private. But since that was his wish, that is what we did. And it's so amazing that in some ways that he kept something so secret, and there was mystery. And yet in his dying, it was an example. I mean, I think that it was his example of this is the way to die. Share it, live it, feel it. And the amazing thing is that as soon as he died, as soon as he passed, and we sent out that message, Doug and Darcy Orr, the former president and his wife of the college, were in Costa Rica. And when they got that message, they told me the story that a crow flew over the ocean. And Darcy Orr, who was a watercolorist, painted the crow and gave it to me. And I will always believe that that is part of whatever the mystery and the magic of life is. It's those times when there's like synchronicity that can't be explained. And so just like John Casey, in so many ways, is an enigma, whatever that word is. And so he has that mysterious part of him, and being his wife for 27 years, I mean, I thought I knew most all about him, but he blew my mind at those last few days of what kind of a man he really was, how many lives he impacted, what those students had to say. We had 2 students that had come here that had driven from somewhere north for several hours, and they were so afraid when they arrived that he was already going to be dead, and he could no longer speak, but they didn't care, and they wanted to go in there, and they had things to say to him about the impact that he had on their lives. And they told me as they were leaving that they only hoped that they could die the way that he died.
Give me a clap.
So tell me about Casey's tattoos and how the crow ties into his life.
Casey, as we know, was an enigma. And
Start over. Enigma.
Enigma. Okay. Should I clap again?
No, you're good.
Casey, as we know, was an enigma. And there were so many things I didn't understand. But somehow, the crow was his totem animal. And he had crows tattooed all over his body, actually. Many crows, like 50 maybe, of different sizes. But he also had lightning bolts and actually a yin-yang sign right above the crack in his butt. And anyway, so I knew about the crows, but Doug and Darcy Orr would have had no way of knowing that the crow was his totem animal. And so it was such an amazing story to me that when they got the message that he had actually died, that they saw a crow fly over the ocean. And I've been told that crows don't go to the ocean, but there must have been a crow that day. And I now believe that was Casey working through Darcy Orr to send me a crow to watch over me. And so that's why I've given it her watercolor painting of the crow. I've given it a special place in my house so that I see it often and think of Casey's spirit as watching over me.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Okay. So tell me more about Casey and his running naked and where he actually did that.
Okay, so part of the reason that Casey is such a legend is that he started running naked early on, and he went out in the dark. He ran naked in the dark because he didn't want to run into anybody. So, I mean, like, we're 4 o'clock in the morning, he would leave to go running in the dark, and the only clothes he had on were his tennis shoes, and sometimes he went barefooted. But other than that, he was, buck naked. And through those years, there were students that sometimes camped out up on the hill behind our house in Dogwood, and they would see him run past. And so legend, they handed it down to other students, and pretty soon in fact they called the trail out here the Casey Connector, because there were so many stories of Casey running naked through the woods and being seen, by some students, and then students would start asking other students, have you ever seen Casey running through the woods? So that was part of his legend, but that surely wasn't all of his legend. But obviously the reason that he ran naked was he was trying to blur the distinction between separation, and that he wanted to become the wind that he was running with, or the snow that he was running in, or the rain. And the only time that evidently it broke, it was like if he fell down, he tripped, and then all of a sudden he had pain, and he came back to the reality that we are separate, and he wanted to blur that distinction. He was making the point that we really are all one. He wanted to experience it. He didn't see, how could he teach such a thing if he didn't first experience it himself, so that he could say, yes, I know this, I've experienced it. And he says in his letter that he's not suggesting that his students all run naked, but that he wanted to make the point that we are all one, and that he was trying to experience that in the best way that he knew how to do that.
You've mentioned the letter many, many, many times.
Do you want her to read it?
No,
Give us the
give me the story of
when he wrote the letter.
When he wrote the letter, did he give it to you? Did he ask you to send it out to so that way I can kind of get some context to say this is what she's talking about, the letter.
Okay. So what's the story behind this letter? How did he send this to you? Did he hand it to you, or did he send it via email? So tell us that.
Okay.
Bring that in.
So when he got the news that he would probably only have another week or two at best to live, he knew there would be many students that would need comfort, because he was still teaching. He taught up to a week, 2 weeks before he died. He was in the classroom, and those students were very attached to him, and he was teaching classes that they loved and that they needed to graduate. So he felt a great sense of responsibility that he wasn't going to be able to finish. So he composed a letter on his computer, and he sent me a copy, and he sent the dean of the college a copy with the instructions, please send this out to the students. And so that is what happened. I read it on the computer, and as everybody else did, and since then that letter has gone out to many, many people in New York, in California, you name it. But I think that letter, it just sort of captured in one letter what all his life had been about. but really, really about letting in the light, living in your dying, experiencing what that means, being fully present with that, and then dying. And through that journey, especially at the end, to be willing to share that in all its ugliness, because it was not pretty when he was dying. That was not pretty. He was dying from bladder cancer, and it had gotten into his spine and into his brain. It was not a pretty thing, and he was determined that it was good for his students to experience that and not have that be hidden. And that is his lesson. And I think Norman Jean is just another testament about that. To be fully engaged, Norman Jean is she's a celebration of what she stands for. I, in the beginning, saw her as something that was ugly. I now understand that she represents diversity in a way that we all need to understand and accept it, and to see the beauty in that diversity. And that is what Casey wanted to do. He wanted to open up our minds, that we could see more and more beauty, let more and more light in, and less judgment, and less separation, that we're all one. And that was his lesson.
Give me a clap.
It was a surprise to you that he wanted to share his death. And as he was dying, you discovered that he had a side that wasn't the one that some people saw, which was, as you described. Go ahead and tell me about that other side to Casey and how you saw a different side as he was dying.
As Casey was dying, and of course after he died also, I realized that there were so many parts of him that I did not know about, that he did keep private and secret from me. I'll never know what drove him so far to go so far in the Lakota language. I can tell you that the Lakota language is not an easy thing to master. And so I don't know about that. And so one of his enigmas is the fact that, so the part of him that was closed up, if you want to put it that way, and that he kept private to himself, and that I didn't know what drove him to go so extreme in the Lakota culture and language. And he had books and books on the Lakota language and all the American Indians. He had such a heartfelt connection with them. I don't know where that came from. And I think that it was really mysterious that he would want to share so much at his death, that he could be so open in his dying. And for me, that would have been a time that I would have wanted it to have been private. I wouldn't have wanted anyone to have seen me dying. And so I wasn't really on board with opening up the door until these students started coming through, and I heard about their love. They showed me their love. They loved me because I was his wife. It was an amazing journey from the time that when he came home from the hospital and we opened that door until the time that he died, that I had so much more to learn about this man that I had been married to for 27 years. Because I already knew there was a part of him that was what we called prickly. And he could be very cantankerous. But he was a man who could stand against a crowd. And so at Warren Wilson, there were many times that his colleagues will tell you that when everybody else wanted to see it one way, there was one man standing there against the crowd telling why that he thought it should be this other way. So there were many parts of him that I did not know about. And to tell you the truth, in the final, that when I got the news that he was dead, and I went into my meditation place where I meditate at, and was trying to comprehend the whole thing, and to realize that there was this part of him that was so stoic that did not share after he had just shared bare. I mean, obviously he was sharing himself when he ran naked, but people weren't seeing him, but he surely was being bare when he lay dying. And I really did have the flash that I think that he was a reincarnated Indian chief. That's what came to me that first time, and I don't know what's true. I know that from Casey that we live in the questions. So was he a great Indian chief that had been reincarnated? And who knows? But he surely had a lot of mysteries about him, and he surely changed my life, and he surely was a supporter of mine. He was my foundation. And the best thing that we had in our relationship was our talks. And talking to Casey was where the beauty of our relationship laid at. And other people will tell you the same thing, that's talking to Casey. Whether it was his colleagues at the college or it was his students, but just talking to Casey and being in his presence. And yet there was this other part of him that he could be very prickly and irritated and wanted to be left alone at times. And anyway, but I think that's the nature in some ways of human beings. I mean, I think that all of us have, some mysteries about us that we don't share with everybody and that we don't need to, and that there might be parts of us that we never share completely. And so then we're back into the questions. Who was he? Who am I? Who is anybody? And how do you define that? And what part of the life do you look at to try to understand who somebody was? And all I can do is go back to, he was an example of living a life fully lived. He surely, we have only touched the surface of what that man was all about. And I'm just glad to have known him.
That was lovely.
So you talk about the questions that Casey left you with. And when you were married for 27 years, was that a common theme in your marriage? And if so, how did that transpire and leave you still living in those questions?
When I met Casey, my belief system was pretty solid. As a young girl, I had been a Jehovah's Witness, where I believed that everything was black and white, and it was either right or wrong, and there wasn't gray. That's what I thought as a young person. When I met Casey, he began teaching me about living in the questions, and that the questions were okay, and that you didn't have to have the answer. That it was more important really to have the questions than it was to have the answers. And so what finally happened, actually just the other day, that Colin, his student that now lives with me, and gives me much comfort because he's very much like Casey. But anyways, and I said to Colin the other day, I think of all the things that Casey left me with was living in the question, and that the questions are okay. And Colin said, yep, I think that's what he gave me too, living in the questions, and living in the questions is okay. And so I love Casey, and I have loved him long, but I also love the part of him, of his mind, that was so willing to just go anywhere, so that I too now. When I think about the definition of living in the questions and what does that mean, for me it just means that, as I said earlier, as a young girl I had the answers. And so if you have the answers, you don't need to ask a lot of questions. When you don't have the answer, then you can keep asking questions about what else am I not seeing? How else can I see this? If you're talking to somebody that has a different opinion than yours, I see that in Colin. We had a Jehovah's Witness lady that has been coming here because Colin wants to engage her, because he wants to ask her all kinds of questions. He's trying to understand in why does she believe what she believes, and how does that impact her life, and what else can she tell him about her belief system. And that's why he wants to teach philosophy and religion. That's why he wants to become that, because he has all these questions that he doesn't have the answers to, and he wants to find it out about all the religions and all the philosophical beliefs in the whole wide world. I mean, that is what Colin and I talk about. So, living in the question, and I would have never thought as a young person that would be something that I would want to do even. I would want to have those answers. But now, after being with John Casey all these years, I'm very content to live in the questions and to forgive myself that I don't know what the answers are and don't really sometimes care what the answers are. I only just want to know more about the questions. So I suppose that's the opposite of fundamentalism, to tell you the truth. Maybe I shouldn't say that.
Well, I think that we're getting there.
Okay.
I don't think that was exactly tying it all in, but I think that we're getting there, and I'm gonna do this real quick.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You flipped your hair up.
Oh, okay.
And put your glasses back on your head just for continuity.
Okay.
Okay. And so let's go back to that.
Okay.
You have a lot of questions about Casey
I
and
do.
his life.
I do.
And tell me, after he died, what did you realize most about what he left you with? The gift. No?
Yeah, I think you're going around.
There's a
You had right after his death, you had a lot of questions, but you keep coming back to the fact that through the 27 years of living with him, that it's okay to have the questions, and that you're content in that now, and that you don't need the answer.
Right.
I like that.
So that's kind of what I wanted
Her to get to.
Yeah,
but,
you to
but
get
I
to,
think
but-
you were going in a different direction. It sounded.
Right. Well, I was going. We were going in the same direction. I just wasn't going to give her the exact answer. Which that's what I wanted you to come to the conclusion of, that you lived that with him for 27 years, and but it was after his death that you realized that was the gift he was giving you all
Okay,
those
got
years.
it, yes.
So if you can put that in your own words,
Okay.
because that's what we've concluded from
Right,
all
from
that you
hearing.
said.
Okay.
Yeah.
We just need it to be more succinct as
Right.
the
Okay.
gift of the 27 years of marriage
Okay,
and his death.
all right,
Okay?
okay. So should I do it?
Go ahead.
I would have to say, when I think about all that has come before, I realize that the gift that he left me is the gift of living in the questions, and that questions are okay, and that it's even okay to not necessarily have the answers, and that I want to live in the search. And so the questions are about constantly seeking what is the truth, what is reality, what is my reality, and is my reality different than someone else's reality, and how do we work that all out? And so thank you, Casey, for the gift that you have given me, that my mind is broad enough now that I can live in the questions.
All right. Go.
So go ahead and tell me what you see as the legacy that John Casey has left you and everyone else as you tell his story.
As I tell this story about John Casey and think about what is the legacy that he left for all of us, I really do believe that at least part of that answer is that we learned to live in the questions, and that the questions were what is most important. Always opening up our minds to another way of thinking about things. always being willing to ask another question. Is that the whole truth of it? So I think that is the legacy of John Casey, and that is why he wrote the letter to his students that he did, and that in that letter that he talks about there being no separation, and between us and us all being all one, and how do you come to that? And of course that in itself is just another question. So that's the legacy of John Casey.
Do that again. Like I think you were searching for. It sounded like you were searching for answers. Speak. Go in a different direction if you want to. What did he leave? What did he leave us with?
Well, I think actually the one thing that I haven't said that is really such a part of all this is about love. Because he loved me, he loved his students, and we all loved him. And so this legacy that he left was he was willing to be completely bare in his dying and to share that ugliness because he loved, and he knew that they loved him. And I never really realized how much he was loved by his students until I passed through this experience. But so I think his legacy, besides asking the questions, is very much about love. I think that's part of his love somehow. However you would ask that question, that it is about love and being open, even though there were so many parts of him that, I hate to say closed, but surely were mysterious, and that I didn't know about at the time. And it's only in his dying that I've learned so many things about other parts of him that I really didn't know existed, and why he would have never talked about or bragged about the beautiful artwork that was in the basement for 30 years packed up, and now I find all these things. That's part of the enigma of John Casey's legacy, I guess. More questions?
That's beautiful.
So when I think back over these last few weeks and months, and actually the years, I am amazed at how much I didn't know about John Casey. I have discovered in these last few weeks and months, he died on February 24th of 2017. And since then, I have discovered in one box a pair of perfectly carved hands. They're not stained, they don't have anything on them, they're just pure raw wood. And when I looked at them, I realized those are his hands. Totally. It's as though he came back from the grave. And that isn't the only thing that I found. I found a book, a huge book with all kinds of pictures of the sweat lodge and the building of the sweat lodge. And actually there's even Lakota language in that book that he used during the ceremonies. And there's the handouts that he used at the ceremonies to prepare people for a traditional Lakota ceremony, sweat lodge, which is what he was doing. So when I think about all the things that I've discovered about him that I didn't know, I wonder how much else is out there. How many other people do I don't even know that he impacted? Because I only know about a few hundred. I mean, I don't know whether it amounts to 1,000 or not, but I have the letters from them about attesting to how he changed their lives, and I would like to know more about that. And as a result of their life being changed, what did that mean? How did their life change, and what was it he taught them that would make them change their entire life? So there's so much more to John Casey's legacy And so there we are, we're back to the questions, you know, how many more questions are there with answers out there? And I don't know the answer to that. I only know that almost every day I find a new thing about John Casey that I didn't know, even though I knew much about him after being with him for 30 years and being married to him for 27 years. But living in the questions, and I know there's a lot more questions out there that I would like answers to. So that's what I would say about his legacy. I don't know what the whole legacy is yet. Time will tell. There's no place to find the mind. No place to find the mind. No place to find the mind. It's like the footprints of the birds up in the sky. Sunshine, moon glow. Sunshine, moon glow. Sunshine, moon glow. There's no place my mind don't go. There's no place to find the mind. No place to find the mind. No place to find the mind. It's like the footprints of the birds up in the sky. So I tried to write a song that would sort of capture this whole idea of John Casey and what he was all about. So this is what I came up with. John Casey was a man who ran naked through the woods, a legend like no other one. Imagine if you could, running naked through the wind. He became the wind, running naked through the snow. He became like the snow. There is no separation. No, there really is not one. There is no separation. No, there really is not one. It is as it is. Yes, it is as it is. We are all one. There is no separation. No, there really is not one. There is. John Casey is still here. Okay. I forgot the words.
You're good.
Now clap.
I'm on the other side, just looking back, just on the far side of the hill. I know that I have been there where you are, but now I'm on the other side, just looking back. And there's storms and thorns and death just on the other side, and less laughter than before, to know that just ahead a ways is an arrow in my head, and I'll never again be quite the same. I'm on the other side, just looking back, just on the far side of the hill. I know that I have been there where you are, but now I'm on the other side, just looking back. And the people who are gone can't tell us anymore what they learned or who they love. But of all the things that's changed, only love remains the same, and its power I finally understood. I'm on the other side, just looking back, just on the far side of the hill. I know that I have been there where you are, but now I'm on the other side. I'm on the other side. I'm on the other side, just looking back.
Okay, I can still hear it in my ears. Will you do just some, without you singing, like just guitar music? I think that would be kind of nice to run underneath the whole thing. Like,
Okay.
And it kind of, I don't know what the music should be. I don't want it to be that upbeat. I want it to be.
Well, and I do like the Way Down in Missouri, in that that's the John
that's
Casey.
okay,
I like
that's
that.
perfect.
Yeah,
That's perfect.
which is the
so
humming.
yeah,
Okay.
so give me some of that just so that we can run that, like maybe under title or to
Okay.
lead in or to lead out. You know.
It's like a couple minutes of it.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. You can go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. We're pushing it on time in the camera, but do give me some without humming. Just give me the guitar.
Without the humming, right?
Yeah, right.